Hello, everyone, and welcome to all of our attendees for attending this upcoming panel discussion that's entitled Players and Products. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be building upon the discussion that happened just earlier. And I hope you had a chance to listen to that because it was a terrific discussion. But this session here is what we're going to be doing is we're going to be building upon it and examining the transformation that we all agree is currently taking place in the fleet supply chain from the perspective of both fleet end users and also from suppliers and industry analysts. So with that, I'd like to kick off our discussion by first having everyone introduce themselves. And perhaps lower left, I'd like to ask you, Angie, if you can introduce yourself and then everyone follow suit.
Sure. My name is Angie Lauer, and I am the Assistant Vice President at Enterprise Fleet Management. I oversee the Vehicle Acquisition Department.
And Chris?
Chris Visser with JD Power. I work on the valuations for the Commercial Truck Guide and do all the commercial truck market analysis for JD Power.
Okay, very good. And Lee?
Hi, I'm Lee Kirby. I'm with Pepsico. I'm the Senior Fleet Manager, and my responsibility is the capability management for all of our Pepsi locations.
Okay, very good. And how big a fleet do you manage, Lee?
We've got about 26,000 pieces of equipment.
Okay, so substantial. So let's get our discussion started. Would like to examine this discussion from the standpoint of the commercial vehicle segment. And as we all agree, we're on the cusp of transformation, and it's being driven by two factors, two prominent factors. One is the electrification of commercial vehicles and the implementation of new technologies and auxiliary equipment technologies. And I'd like to start the discussion here by turning to Angie, and perhaps what you might be able to do is examine it from different market segments. I know one of the areas that is going to be impacted not only on the commercial side, but is the government side. Could you address those two areas for us?
Yeah, sure. What I will say is that in the past 4 to 6 months especially, we have seen a huge increase in questions and interest across the whole commercial segment on EVs. So it's been pretty pronounced, but it's most pronounced in the government segment. And this is for good reason. There's a few factors that are playing into it. So number one, on the federal level, the Biden administration has committed to decarbonization by 2050, which includes a $500 million investment to convert their federal fleet to EVs. And they're also, their goal is to have 500,000 charging stations by 2050. So that's the federal level. From a state level, states like California, Massachusetts, they're banning the sale of ICE vehicles by 2035. And of course, that doesn't just affect government customers, it affects anyone who drives in that state. So certainly we're seeing interest from consumers in those states, specifically more than other states that may not have those mandates. But even of the customer base and the commercial customers in those states, it is the government customers that are moving a little quicker. And then finally, on the municipal and the local level, we're also seeing an increase in mandates and EV goals. A great example is the city of New York that's committed to converting their 20,000 vehicle fleet to EVs by 2050. So definitely a lot of movement and interest on the government side.
Yeah, and then speaking on the government side, now because it's a quasi-government organization, but just last week, the U.S. Postal Service also likewise committed to convert to electrification of 10% of its fleet, either by buying new EVs or retrofitting existing product to run on EV. What about on the commercial side, Angie? What do you see going on there?
So what I would say there is it's definitely interest, a lot of questions, particularly on like infrastructure and how charging stations will work. What we're waiting to see is how that interest translates to actual demand. So that's still kind of growing. But like I said, last 4 to 6 months, we've received more questions than ever from our clients about EVs for sure.
Okay, very good. And Lee, as an end user, you know, you're doing, PepsiCo's made a major commitment to electrification, not only with the chassis, but also with some of the changes that you're making with your auxiliary and add-on equipment.
Yeah, especially when you look at our size of our fleet and we're dealing with heavy duty trucks, Mike, and from an EV technology standpoint versus a diesel gasoline engine, we're looking at the availability of saving revenue, if you will, because for us, you shed a mile a gallon with the number of vehicles that we've got and the number of miles that we run in our equipment. That's a considerable amount of money that's going to be saved. So there's a heavy interest in us looking at EV technology and will it work. A lot of our technology is a day-to-day operation and doesn't run very many miles. And in the same token, we also have transport vehicles that run thousands of miles. So we've got a full spectrum that we have to worry about from an EV technology, from our long haul to our short haul business. That's really going to play into how we go after the EV market.
Mm-hmm. And what about on the infrastructure side? A lot of your vehicles are centrally maintained, centrally garaged. I imagine infrastructure is also part and parcel with this whole commitment that you're making on the EV initiative.
Yeah, just like Angie was saying, the whole technology about charging stations, when you look at, our facility has anywhere from 20 to 50 to 75 vehicles parked that all need to be charged. They all need to be going the next day on the road. So that whole infrastructure piece is certainly something of very, very interesting for us, and how we build our garages out, how we build our parking spots out, how we're going to charge those particular trucks. So all of that is in a state of investigation right now, Mike.
Mm-hmm. And how is the service industry? Is that keeping pace with your goals, the direction that PepsiCo wants to go in, or is there still a bit of lag time there in terms of product availability, expertise, and so on?
I think in both fronts, right? The product availability, we've seen Tesla come into the market. There's some other OEMs that are starting to pilot some vehicles and get those into the hands of the consumers like us, and start some pilots down that road. So now the next question that I'm responsible for is the capability of our technicians. Do we have the expertise to go work on them? Do we have the right tooling to go work on them? Is our garages set up correctly? All of those pieces have yet to be defined. We're kind of waiting to see what that truck is going to look like, and then start designing our garages to adapt to being able to charge those vehicles, being able to, what's it going to look like when we go to work on them? Today, we're used to repairing diesel engines. It's a mechanical engine. Tomorrow, it's an electric motor. So it's a whole different mindset from a technician standpoint, as well as a tooling standpoint.
Right. And it's not to say that there's not a technician shortage nowadays. So, you're having trouble just finding technicians to operate on diesel or gasoline engines. What's your forecast on that? I mean, how are you going to be filling that technician shortage to operate on the EV units? You can be training them from within, growing them from within, or do you expect that to be an enticement to bring new people into our industry?
I think you hit it on the head. It's all three. It's our existing technicians that understand our business, understand what it takes to maintain a vehicle. They're going to have some knowledge about that. And then we're going to have to bring into our garages, our locations, some new technicians, maybe out of technical schools, maybe somebody that's out of electrician school, right? These are electrical motors. So we're trying to experiment where to go find that particular person that's going to allow us or have the capability to come work in our garages to outline that. So it's still in a state of flux, if you will.
Yeah, and there's a lot of changes that'll be happening not only on the acquisition side, but operations side, remarketing side with EVs. But one of the significant things that I hear from, and I'd like to address this question to you, Angie, is service life on EVs. The anticipation is that with fewer moving parts and so on, these EVs are going to be lasting much longer than what we've traditionally been used to with internal combustion engines. And do you share that point of view? And how is that going to be impacting the industry?
Yeah, for sure. I definitely think that the service life on these EVs will be longer. I saw a study in Consumer Reports that said the average battery life will last 200,000 miles. And so if we translate that to years, I know it depends on what what the vehicle is used for, but that could be 10 to 13 years. So it is definitely longer. And we do expect some battery degradation over that time, but it's something like a cell phone where you could really see that battery start to degrade. And we've seen, OEMs our conversations with them, they do not expect battery failure. So, I definitely agree with what you're saying. How it impacts the industry, I think that longer service life contributes to the total cost of ownership model that's helping to bring that total cost of ownership down, combined with lower maintenance costs and, of course, the fuel savings. It contributes to where those total cost of ownership is lower on the EVs than on ICE vehicles. And so I think that can start to help transition consumers and customers into EVs from their ICE vehicles because of that. I saw one model that showed it was a $4,000 savings over the course of the life of the vehicle for an EV model versus a similar ICE vehicle. So definitely an impact on probably transitioning quicker over to EV vehicles for consumers.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up, total cost of ownership, or TCO, because that's really crucial in a lot of fleet decisions as to what they're going to be bringing into service. And of course, yeah, there will be TCO savings in the sense that you'll have no fuel if you're operating the vehicle longer. Maybe acquisition might be higher, but the crucial thing, in my mind at least, and even when you're doing TCO for regular internal combustion engines, is depreciation. That's your largest expense, and that really influences whether a vehicle, makes the cut or doesn't make the cut in a lot of cases. And that's where I'd like to turn the conversation over to you, Chris, from your experience at NADA, also with JD Power. What are your forecasts in terms of EV residuals? And it's not like we have a lot of experience in that area. So how are you forecasting this, and maybe even give us more insights in that?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to be able to talk about actual data, but of course, most of this is theoretical right now because there is no data out there, especially in the commercial market for the most part. Now, that said, there are a few things we can assume. Two most important factors I see in EV residuals are battery pack life and a supply-demand imbalance in the first few years of mass EV adoption. So right now, as Angie said, we're looking at about 8 to 10 years for a lifespan for a battery pack. In 10 years, of course, that lifespan is going to be extended, and 10 years is probably when we can see critical mass in EV adoption on the commercial side in most segments. So this means fleets should be able to extend their trade cycles because the maintenance and fuel costs go away to a large extent. So a large fleet with a quick turnover, say a 3-year trade cycle, should be able to extend that cycle by a large margin because depreciation and maintenance are more favorable. Same with the rental company, currently on a 7-year cycle. So in terms of depreciation, to get back to your question, I see EVs holding their value extremely well in the first few years, then losing value as the battery pack gets towards the end of its expected lifespan. So this is kind of the opposite of an internal combustion engine vehicle curve, where the vehicle loses more of its value on the front end as opposed to the midlife.
Great. Go ahead.
Yeah. So after that initial market shift, maybe 10, 15 years down the road, supply starts to look more typical with EVs, and the depreciation curve will probably look more normal as well. The other interesting factor is that EV residuals will be tied to technological improvements. Where any major improvement in battery technology will have a negative impact on the older vehicles that do not have that newer technology. So say, lightweight technology comes into play, major increase in lifespan of the battery pack. So that will impact older technology vehicles. So basically, I'm pretty bullish on EV residuals once the infrastructure is built out. And even though we're still a few years away from that, it will happen fairly quickly. And once that build out reaches critical mass, the market will shift fairly drastically.
Well, while we're on the topic, and we're not going to focus solely on EVs, but while we're on the topic of remarketing, one of the big transitions that occurred as a result of this pandemic was all of our live in-lane auctions shut down. One out of concern for their customers, dealer customers, and also to comply with CDC requirements. And that shifted over to online sales. And for a short period of time, almost 100% of the sales were sold online. What's your forecast on that, Chris? I know in-lane auctions have opened up. They started opening up last June. Still popular with dealers and so on. But how do you see this transition and the trajectory of online versus physical auctions continuing into the future? Will they simply complement one another, or will one take more predominance over the other?
Well, in the past decade or so, there had been a shift towards online, but there are plenty of dealers and buyers who still like going to an auction and bidding in person. So I don't see that changing. That business is certainly not going to go away, the in-person auction business. What's interesting about the shift to 100% online last year is business wasn't affected at all. In fact, the market heated up pretty quickly in May. And in just about every segment of the commercial market, pricing was, increasing pretty dramatically starting a month or two after the initial shutdowns last year. And that's even with 100% remote bidding. Now, keep in mind, remote bidding isn't the same as buying remotely. You can still go to inspect the vehicle. You're just not necessarily bidding in person with a crowd of other people right next to you. And auctions have always offered inspection services, guarantees, warranties that provide confidence when you're bidding online. So essentially, it's been a non-issue in terms of market value for a vehicle. And there's always going to be a portion of dealers and other buyers who want to be at the auction in person. So that's not going to go away. We'll see an incremental increase in the usage of remote bidding, I think, will be the only change going forward.
Yeah, but with this change and transition over to EVs, I know there are a lot of tools out there now that can actually gauge the amount of battery life that's left in a vehicle. Do you envision that becoming a regular part of a condition report? So when a dealer is out there bidding on a product, they have an idea as to what that percentage of battery life is still left?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at Class 8 trucks, one of the basic tools you have to have in your pocket, or if you're doing an appraisal, is a tool you can plug into the PCM to get the mileage and the condition of various sensors, to see what's been replaced and repaired, things of that nature. The extremely high level of technology that goes along with EV vehicles is going to provide all the data that you want, as we've discussed. So yeah, that'll be just the cost of doing business is plugging one of those tools into the PCM of an EV to get all that information. I mean, the battery life is going to be the primary factor in the condition of an EV. Other than chassis components, which suspension and things like that, which don't wear out in the first few years, it's strictly the motors and the battery.
And it seems to me that would lend itself to having a very precise remarketing or resale value formulation. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, the lifespan of the battery will have a huge impact on the resale value of a EV. And that's why I said the depreciation curve is going to look a lot different on EVs, where the expected lifespan of the battery pack will determine when that curve starts to trend downwards.
And plus, also, there's a resale value that I anticipate with used batteries. One of the things that I had heard was, there's a finite amount of lithium on the planet, and being able to accommodate all the millions of EVs that are anticipated to be built over the next decade or so, that there could be a very profitable market on recycling the lithium out of the batteries. And that's presently starting to emerge in Europe. Does anyone want to make any additional commentary in regards to that? Do you see that as a viable way of offsetting some of the depreciation costs? Chris, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure how that would impact the used market. We're going to have to figure out how replaceable these battery packs are going to be in these vehicles. When Teslas first came along, there was talk of replacing the entire pack, the tray, all at once, and that kind of fell by the wayside pretty quickly. And then that was discussed, having it more of a modular component, the battery pack. Haven't heard too much talk of that lately. It might be more of a situation where where it's on the parts and service side of the industry, whether you can buy a remanufactured battery pack for installation.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going to head, Chris. With it is from my standpoint, standing with the technicians, we're plug and play with components, and if we've got a battery pack that we can slide in and slide out for repair, for replacement purposes, depending on cost of that new battery, how's that going to weigh our decision to keep that truck in service versus remarket that truck or sell that truck, right? So we're going to have to really seriously look at the battery cost of it, especially as we get into the technology that's going to be happening in the years to come with these new batteries. Does it make sense for us to plug and play those batteries, or recycle those batteries, or recycle the complete truck?
Mm-hmm. And we kind of do that now with re-refined oil. I mean, you recycle the oil, and where in the past it might have been just disposed, now it's actually sold and returned back to end user customers as re-refined oil. But
Correct.
How does Pepsi handle its remarketing of your vehicles? I know you have a much longer lifespan on your vehicles and a more limited customer base, but maybe if you can share with the audience your remarketing strategies.
Yeah, our remarketing strategy, because we're so large, we're so diverse with over 400 sites, in getting titles and all that, we go with one vendor, and we'll notify that vendor, hey, we've got a piece of equipment that does need to be sold. They will come in and process that remarketing for us, Mike.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's shift gears a bit. One of the things that's happening is if we're addressing transformation that's currently going on within the industry, is that there is transformation that we can see right before us as we pick up our papers or read our feeds on online. But there is a change that's occurring in the OEM landscape. I mean, we're getting new OEMs entering the marketplace. Companies that are doing it for the first time. Lordstown is an example, and so on. What are the implications as we have new OEMs enter the marketplace in terms of now having to create new dealer bases, maintenance networks, and so on? And I know this will be impacting you, Angie, through enterprise fleet management. How are you looking to address that issue, and how you read the changes that are going to be happening?
Yeah, it's definitely going to be impactful. It's exciting to see new players in the market. They have some great products, but unlike the traditional OEMs that already have dealer and maintenance networks, this is something that they're going to have to figure out. So on the dealer side, will they adapt a Tesla model where they don't have that traditional dealer market, or will they go more like the traditional OEMs? They'll have to figure out how to get these vehicles nationwide. And so on the maintenance side, the traditional OEMs have service shops in their dealers that can handle the maintenance on these vehicles. We know that Lordstown, for example, has partnered with Camper World for their maintenance. But what else will they do? Will they consider mobile providers to be able to go directly to clients and repair vehicles on site, which is we see more and more increasing demand for mobile maintenance vendors, or will they partner with other national partners in addition to Camper World to help with their maintenance? It's something that they're going to have to figure out. Drivers want convenience, and they want to make sure that there's a broad enough network to make sure that they can get their vehicles serviced when they need them. Less maintenance, I understand, but still maintenance will need to be done on these vehicles. Mm-hmm. The other thing I think about too is, and it's kind of gets forgotten a little bit, is licensing, plating, registrations. That's often done by a dealer so that when the vehicle arrives, you can get it on the road as quickly as possible. And if they're going to deliver vehicles nationwide, you really have to have expertise in all 50 states on how to plate those vehicles. And I speak from experience because Enterprise does that in all 50 states, and it is complicated. It is no sweet to get that done, but it's super important to be able to do that for clients. Clients want to be able to pull away with their vehicle already plated. So how will they use maybe their dealer networks or other networks to get that done? It's definitely not simple. So those are a few things that I can think of that will need to be considered by the newer OEMs.
And let's build upon that a little bit further. Would that mean the emergence of an additional secondary market with license and title type companies specializing in that area and managing it on an outsourcing basis for new OEMs? I could definitely see that being feasible. Or even an enterprise, for instance, that would be a resource that you could perhaps offer. But could you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, even enterprise outsources some of it. And some states are more difficult than others, and some you can handle in house, and some we actually use third parties. So yeah, I definitely think there may be a market for that. It is very tricky for sure.
Mm-hmm. And we touched upon earlier, operating cost savings with EVs versus your internal combustion engines, and so now we're having new OEMs entering the marketplace. How is that going to be impacting things, if at all? And again, I'd like to leave that with you, Angie, to see what your thoughts are.
Sorry, I think I didn't catch the question. So you're asking the impact on
with new OEMs, assessing what operating costs are going to be, for their product vis-a-vis, internal combustion engines that are currently in the marketplace. And, we did touch upon it earlier, but I was wondering if you might be able to go into it a little bit deeper.
So I think, operating costs, I can tell you from a dealer perspective, those obviously get difficult to establish having, property. And so it'll be just I really don't know how to predict. Certainly those are higher costs to establish all those networks. So I would think that they'd want to go maybe with, especially on the maintenance side, third partners, mobile vendors can be lower operating costs. So, I don't have any solid data or knowledge on that, but it's something we'll just have to see how that all pans out.
Yeah,
well, and Mike, one thing from the fleet perspective is we rely on our dealers to do quite a bit of our warranty work, so we can pick them up and go 10 miles down the road to a dealership. Well, if there's no dealer at that point, where do we go with that truck? So we've got very experienced technicians, very good technicians that can repair a lot of things. But with this new technology coming out, don't know what those things are going to be that's going to fail and how to train those. So if there isn't a dealer network that I can take that truck to, I've got to rely very heavily on that OEM to come train me and my technicians on how to repair their vehicle, so I don't have to go search for somebody else. So there's going to be another leg within that OEM. They're going to sell it, perfect, but how do they train in the parts issues? How do we get parts for these vehicles to keep them on the road? Those are all issues that need to be coming from those new OEMs. They need to figure that strategy out.
And that's a good point, Lee, because you're fortunate as a bigger fleet to have your own technicians that can handle at least a percentage of your service and maintenance needs. Many of the smaller fleets don't have that at all. So the reliance on the OEMs becomes even more critical at that point for those smaller fleets.
And there might even be a third leg to that stool where it increases the reliance of fleet management companies to provide that kinds of services where, maybe in the past, an end user fleet might not have been using it, but out of necessity now they need to, in terms of license, title, warehousing of parts and the maintenance work. Would you agree with that, Angie?
Yeah, for sure. And another point I just, that they'll need to think about is recalls. So today, if there's a recall for a traditional OEM, they go to, bring it to the dealer and it gets fixed. Well, if there's not that network, where does that happen? How do you get recalls fixed? So that's just another component, related to service that will need to be thought about.
And Angie, that brings up a very valid point. Today, with the recalls, if it's a safety recall, most of the OEMs don't want our technician to do that. They're sending their own technicians, or we take the vehicle to them. We've got just recently some new initiatives happening with a couple of the light duty OEMs that are sending mobile techs out on a regular basis now. They put them in a van with a bunch of tools and will go out and service that industry. Even though it's outside of their dealer structure, they'll go sometimes several states wide to get those recalls done. So maybe that is the forefront that's going to start happening, Mike.
Hmm. And PepsiCo, you have warranty stations at a lot of your facilities, correct?
We have ability to do warranty with 95% of the OEMs we do business with.
But in terms of recalls, the OEMs would prefer that you not do that as on a warranty basis.
It's a
as a warranty station?
safety recall, exactly, airbags and things like that. They would like to have their technician do that, but some of the other recalls we can get done.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And one of the other things I think, in terms of maintenance, where you do have those facilities, do dealers, it's in that second tier type national account programs. They may not have the technicians there, and most of these EVs would be required going into the dealership, which potentially has that higher labor cost than an independent company.
Yes, exactly. I mean, you look at the retail garage door rates now, they're extremely high, and rightfully so. They've got to pay their people and do all those things. So when you add the EV complexity to that, where's the limit going to be?
Right. Has JD Power done any research in terms of these forecasts, Chris, that you could address as to how fleets or end users are going to be addressing some of these issues?
Not as of yet, as far as I know.
Mm-hmm.
No,
And what is your forecast in terms of EV sales in coming years? Do you think that sales will actually be achieving these anticipated forecasts, or?
Yeah, since we're just talking about the commercial market, I think the government market will probably be the biggest or the most drastic increase by segment.
Mm-hmm.
And then that will get into the vehicles that are available to everybody, which right now seems to be step vans, light GVW vans, and some Class 6 oriented cabovers and conventionals. So as it's what's going to be first, the push or the pull. There's the whole environment with California moving. We still have 25 years before they're 100% zero emissions, but we only have 10 years before they're looking at about 30 to 50%. So that's California, and that's a pretty big chunk of the market.
Sure.
Then if other states follow suit, then that's a pretty major pull. So that said, it's a race to build out the infrastructure also. So as long as the infrastructure is there, more companies and more consumers will want electric vehicles, especially now that the cost new is not that much more than a regular diesel or gas medium duty truck.
Mm-hmm. So an infrastructure build out or development that doesn't keep pace with actual sales could be a drag on future sales then. Would you anticipate that?
Yeah, you can't have one without the other. The
Mm-hmm.
infrastructure build out is mandatory. Yeah. But that said, I think that will happen as long as the plans that we have on the table right now come to fruition, and the cost benefit for EV is pretty clear. I mean, it's a pretty compelling case.
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to have you keep the floor for a second, Chris, because we're talking about the entry of the new OEMs that we really don't have any sort of history in terms of residual values and so on. How does JD Power address that? How are you going to will you be providing residual forecasts on those new OEMs that'll be entering the marketplace?
Sure, and that's definitely going to be a challenge when you have no data. How do you establish a residual or even set a current value for the vehicle? We have to wait for some secondary market to appear. We can certainly provide estimates. Until we have some actual data, we can't really populate our models and tweak things that way. So as far as new OEMs that come out, that basically just we're talking about the supply of trucks, whether it comes from one OEM or whether it comes from 8 different new OEMs. We're talking about supply and demand fundamentally. So that's what we'll be looking at. There could be a situation where certain OEMs have better reliability ratings and things like that. So we'll have to look at that and see how that all fleshes out. But fundamentally, we're going to be looking at supply and demand, and the factors we mentioned: infrastructure build out, incentives, tax incentives will establish the market.
Right. And we maybe to get back to you, Lee, in terms of your acquisition strategies. A key part is obviously ROI, and there are a lot of classes of vehicles that you'd be acquiring that may be both internal combustion and could have an EV counterpart. How do you determine that rate of ROI on those vehicles vis-a-vis one another? Or does that even come into play? I've heard from some fleet managers where, the corporate sustainability strategy is to hit certain targets, and in some cases, it actually makes acquisition or total cost of ownership costs kind of secondary if that's your only choice.
Yeah, it's kind of out of my wheelhouse, but it is a sustainability project that we have going on, and there's a lot of ROI, like you said, Mike, that we're looking at. One of them is, like Angie said, is the pure maintenance costs. Maintaining a new diesel engine today with DEF and DPFs and all of the regulation equipment that's on there. For the long haul of 10 to 15 years while you're keeping that vehicle versus an electric motor being in there and there's no maintenance on it. Then you've got to factor in the fuel that's there. Is there a reduction in licensing and titling because you're not burning a fossil fuel? So there's all these variables that we're looking at, to try and understand and try and come up with some type of an ROI to factor into that purchase price.
Mm-hmm. And with all of your companies, you're forecasting, what sales are, where your company is going to be in the future. With this transition towards EVs, like from Enterprise's standpoint, Angie, what kind of timetable are we looking at in terms of just ballpark percentage figures in terms of your portfolio? How do you see that changing over the coming years or through this coming decade?
Yeah, it's certainly a lot of unknowns at this point, but we have done some extensive research to try to answer that exact question for our client base. And at this point, our estimates are that we will see 10% of ICE vehicles transition to EVs in the next 3 to 5 years. And then after that, it'll ramp up quicker after that. There are still some roadblocks. Of course, the infrastructure, we've talked about that. But other things that we hear is, number one, smaller fleets and their ability to even get an EV in the next few years. We've read in the news that a lot of larger companies are stepping up and gobbling up a lot of the allocation. So demand in the next couple of years could simply outpace the allocation, and smaller fleets won't even be able to get their hands on these EVs. That remains to be seen. So that could be a barrier. And then what we hear from our clients too is just overwhelming information. So many new entries to the market. There's so much out there, so many things to consider. It's almost overwhelming. So you put it off a little bit. So one of the things that we suggest to them is, a thoughtful plan. Where do you want to be in 3 years and 5 years and 10 years, et cetera? And I think if you can stick to a plan and have a plan and dissect some of that information, it makes it a little easier. So lots of unknowns still, but that is our best estimate is 10% conversion in 30
and, yeah, one of the factors that's extremely critical to commercial fleets is order to delivery times and so on. What impact do you think that these vehicles will have in that area, or is it going to be really no change whatsoever? What impact would you assess?
Yeah, we haven't seen a big difference up until this date, and so that I don't know if I could make an accurate prediction on that. You're absolutely right that it means it's a very important consideration when clients order vehicles. They want them as quickly as possible. We're seeing enough delays right now just on the ICE vehicles with all the, the microchip shortages and steel and all of that stuff. So it remains to be seen.
Out of curiosity, do these microchip shortages come into play with the EVs? I don't know myself. I just
I don't know that either. I don't know.
Would you know, Chris?
No visibility into that.
Yeah, because a lot of those systems, would be in terms of, I guess, the engine control modules, which, wouldn't come into play with EVs. So, but Angie was mentioning that their forecast is 10% of their portfolio being EV in the next 3 years or so. And what percentage do you see your fleet, Lee, with PepsiCo being EV oriented?
Yeah, Mike, what I can tell you is we have our engineering group in touch with all of the OEMs, and we're pushing as hard as we can to secure EVs. And again, it's going to go back to their ability to supply the number of EVs. That remains to be seen right yet, is where the production is with the OEMs, whether that's a class 7 or 8 truck or some of the light duty trucks. We just don't know. From the amount of vehicles that we purchase every year, it's considerable. So we're open to the EV. It's just going to depend on what they can produce for us.
Right. Would you envision sometime in the future where PepsiCo's 100% EV fleet, or is that just impractical because of the types of applications that you have?
100% was probably going to be a real far stretch, because we have some vehicles that run, 1 million miles in 5 years. So they're running over 100,000 miles a year. That battery life is not there yet, but some of our light duty vehicles, some of our day-to-day operations, I can see that happening in.
Okay, very good. And another factor that's going to come into play with all of this, and I'd like to address this to you, Chris, is really regulatory changes. I mean, there's some states such as California that are mandating that after a certain date, you can't be selling certain internal combustion engines there, incentives. There's a lot of tax credits for EV adoption. How does that come into play in terms of how you envision the acquisition appetite being for those vehicles? And then on the flip side, do they have any bearing in terms of the resale or residual value considerations?
Yeah, well, I'll answer the second part first. Up until now, the incentives have all been on the new side, so the secondary buyer doesn't benefit from them. For example, the $7,500 credit, that's strictly on the new side. It does impact residuals, though, if you're leasing, because it lowers the initial purchase price. The interesting thing about incentives is it's like I said, the cost new of an EV is really not much greater than a traditional gas or diesel van anyway at this point. So the lighter GVW electric offerings are comparable already without an incentive. The most effective incentives going forward will be probably business tax deductions and assistance with infrastructure build out. So if a fleet wants to build out an internal infrastructure for recharging, there could be some tax incentives that might work there. In fact, that was just proposed a few days ago to provide incentives for charging infrastructure. So I think that pretty much covers what I could predict about acquisition incentives at this point. We're talking about, or the administration right now is talking about extending incentives. California's was good for under 14,000 GVW, which covers a good portion of the class 3-4 market, and that's a good portion of the last mile segment, which is where a good portion of the short-term development is happening. That's where we'll probably see the most change in the market in the next few years.
Yeah, my company is celebrating its 60th anniversary this year. So one of the things that we've done is we've been tracking milestones that have been happening since the inception. In fact, we've gone back to the start of the fleet industry. And I would say probably the biggest disruption that's happened in our industry is the pandemic that we're currently going through right now. It's impacted, new vehicle production, temporarily shutting it down, not seen since the Second World War. DMV shutting down, whole new safety protocols being issued, and so on. But we are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, and I'd like to, maybe close out our presentation by examining some of the trends that the three of you might be seeing as we enter a post-COVID environment, and likewise, what lingering effects from the pandemic that we're currently experiencing now do you see continuing once we do get into that post-COVID period? And maybe to start off with you, Lee, how has the pandemic impacted your fleet, and where do you see it going in a post-pandemic period?
Yeah, specifically, Mike, and because we run so many garages and we had so many technicians in a finite area, it was the number of people that were exposed to our technicians. There was a lot of people going through our fleet shops at any time of the day. So COVID put a stop to that. So we threw up some roadblocks to people going through our fleet shops. That was one of the good things that come out of COVID for us, is stopping all that traffic coming through. One of the bad things for us is we do a lot of in-person training, so I could not have my trainers in the facility or out with my guys teaching them the new aspects of these vehicles. So that was a bad thing that COVID happened, is stopping all of our training mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. And do you, with the traffic through the maintenance shops, I could see how that would definitely be an issue for potential contagion in the pandemic period. But do you see that continuing in a post-COVID environment? Do you see Pepsico still maintaining that, where you're restricting the number of people going through your maintenance facilities?
Hopefully so, because it cuts down on because our technicians are there to work on that vehicle, get that vehicle back on the road. And if you've got 15 people that come through that shop and spend 3 to 5 minutes talking to a technician, that's a couple of hours of unproductivity time that's there. So the more people that we can limit going to our shops, the better our productivity we're going to be able to get out of those shops.
Okay. And your vehicles, are they assigned to particular employees, or is it kind of a pool environment? And forgive me for not knowing how PepsiCo handles that, but
that's okay. Well, the way we're set up is we'll have 1 to 10 people at a fleet shop. They're assigned to that shop, that location. So all of those technicians own those pieces of equipment.
But what about the assets that are being driven? Is that assigned to a specific driver, or is that like in a pool environment as to what's available?
It depends on what that vehicle is used for. I would say 90% of our vehicles, because they're sales vehicles, are in a pool, and they go out and grab that particular vehicle.
So there's a lot of protocols that are in place to make sure that the disinfectant of vehicles, do you see that progressing beyond the pandemic, or do you see that ultimately fading away?
I think that will probably fade away once we get through the sanitization of the steering wheels and the shifter knobs and all that. Once that goes away, I think we'll find ways to spend that time elsewhere.
So we're down to our last minute, Angie. I apologize for giving you such short time, but how does enterprise see this for your clients? Because you have a real cross section of the entire economy as part of your client base.
Yeah, we sure do. I think, in the interest of time, I'll shorten it to, we're really watching dealer inventory. We see that lingering. It's very low right now. And a lot of our clients buy directly from dealer inventory rather than ordering, so if they can't, they need those cars quickly, small and medium-sized businesses, and they can't always get them because dealer inventory is low. And how long will that last? The short model year for ordering, how will that affect 2022 allocation and delivery time? So those are the things we're kind of watching in the upcoming months with lingering effects of COVID.
Yeah, there may be a domino effect into 2022. Hopefully not. But so with that, I want to thank all of you for your great comments, great observations and insights into the industry. And thank you very much. And I think we've now reached the end of our time. So I will wrap it up right now. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
All right.